This is Impact Healthcare, people and strategies that are disrupting the health benefits industry. And now, here's your host, healthcare benefits industry expert and the originator of the transparent health benefits movement, Lester Morales.
Welcome back to another episode of the Impact Healthcare podcast. I was telling my guests, and I don't get like starstruck very often, but in our business, I've got a celebrity on my podcast. So if you're listening, you're in for a real treat. Wendell Potter, welcome to the Impact Healthcare podcast.
Lester, thanks so much. I've been looking forward to this.
Wendell, so in case there are people that don't know who you are, give us an introduction of you, your past, and maybe what you're doing today, because it's diverse and I think it's going to set us up for a great conversation.
Well, thanks. I'm a former health insurance company executive. I worked for 20 years for two very big companies, Humana and Cigna. Part of the buca, if you will, that's often used to describe the big players in health insurance in this country. I worked in corporate communications for both companies. I was vice president of corporate communications at Cigna. I was the company's chief spokesman. My name was on all the company's financial disclosures for 10 years, so I had to know how the company made money, where it came from, what they did with it. And I also had a foot in Washington. I worked with my peers across the industry and with our trade groups to influence public policy. I previously, in a past life, had been a reporter. I used to cover Congress and the White House as a reporter. So I'm a journalist by training, and that's what led me into the corporate communications work. But I had visibility into how these big companies operate in ways that very few people do. I was reporting to the president of Humana when I left and was recruited to Cigna, and I worked with investor relations a great deal, and I came to understand how these companies are so beholden to their investors, and it's almost slavish devotion to Wall Street, and a handful of Wall Street financial analysts. And I came to understand the consequences of that. So I left after 20 years, and I ultimately became a very vocal critic of the industry, and I still am. I have also returned to journalism in a certain way. I have a newsletter that I publish called Healthcare Uncovered, because in my view, the media does a pretty lousy job of covering healthcare and certainly covering the health insurance business. So that's what we do. And I also, once again, spend a lot of time in Washington trying to educate lawmakers and on both sides of the aisle. And I have an advocacy organization called the Center for Health and Democracy, which advocates for reforming our healthcare system to make it less expensive for consumers and employers and a lot more fair than it is now.
Do you sleep, Wendell? Do you sleep? So Wendell, I often, and knowing your history, know that there is something in your belly that fires you up. I mean, you are somebody who stood up against, the beast. And I'm wondering what's that thing? What's that thing that just fires you up, that either in a, hey, I want to punch somebody in the face fired up, or I want to jump, in front of a bullet to save people. What's that thing that fires you up?
It is just dealing with the injustice of what has of how our system has developed. I come from a working class family, a farming and working class family, and I came to see how big corporations that I worked for and the industry began to just view people as dollar signs, as very dis- disposable people who are useful in some regards, as long as they stay healthy, as long as they can get employer dollars or government dollars to insure them in some way. But I came to see how poorly patients are treated, how poorly in such low regard that these companies often have for their customers, and that includes employers certainly, but also the workers and their families, and I I came to see this most especially when I was having to help create the marketing strategy for high deductible plans. And I was a believer in that. I believe for a good deal of my career that people do need to have some skin in the game to understand more of the real cost of healthcare. I was certainly bought into that. But I began to see that this was a strategy to saddle more people with the cost of healthcare, and the insurance companies were off the hook for paying claims that they otherwise would have paid. Long answer, I know, but I just came to see that the companies were building barrier after barrier after barrier to make it more and more difficult for people to get the care that they need. But yet every year premiums go up. And there's a term for that in the industry that you don't hear very often. You just hear that behind closed doors, usually between an executive at an insurance company and an investor or an analyst, benefit buy down, which is a term that describes what we're talking about here. Premiums going up every year, but people are finding that their policies are less valuable every single year. That's not sustainable. It's not fair. And I felt that this has got to change. I realized also, Lester, that there are limits to what you can do on the inside. And I think most people you talk to who are inside one of these big companies would acknowledge that. It's a system that has created that no individual really can do much to change because there's so much money involved.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's not quite on the same side, but obviously I come from a large consulting house with kind of the same scenarios, right? It's you got to move the stock price. We're going to tie, everybody's compensation to the stock price moving, and when that's the case, you tend to make decisions that are appropriate with the incentives that are being outlaid, right? I don't think that people wake up in the morning wanting to do harmful things. I think, like my mom told me when I was young, you want to know somebody's true intentions, follow the money. I just think that that's the case. Wendell, when we were prepping for this, I asked you, "Hey, what do we want to tackle on this?" And you said, "I want to teach people how to fix healthcare." So, being that we can't have a Harvard MBA class on this, if I asked you kind of to lay out maybe I wanna talk about a couple things. I wanna talk about the observations of why the system, in my opinion, isn't broken. It's completely designed wrong. I'd love to talk about that. I'd love to talk about the high deductible. We might call it scam, but we're gonna call it, the reason it's not the thing that we all thought it would. And I want you to highlight some of the things that you're seeing that give you that ray of hope, because you wake up every day still fired up, still doing the work. And so I would assume that there are things out there that are giving you a glimmer of hope that you're like, man, we're starting to make some momentum. So I think if we tackled those three things, we would have a very successful call.
Well,
So
Gunner,
talk to me about that. You've been behind the beast. You've seen it in Washington. You're an expert in it. The healthcare system's not broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to work. When you hear that, expand on that.
and you're exactly right. It was not necessarily designed this way, but it is the way it is, and it makes a lot of money for a lot of companies. And I think that a big I would say a mistake that happened about 30 or more years ago. It's kind of a fork in the road in which a lot of insurance companies began to convert to for-profit status. It hasn't been all that many years ago that we had insurance companies who were, most of them were nonprofit Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans. But then big life insurance companies and others decided they saw the opportunity to make a lot of money on health insurance, and they were right. There was a lot of money to be made there. My first job for one of these big companies was at Humana when Humana had hospitals, and I was hired essentially to to work and support the hospital division of the company. But while I was there, the company decided, well, there's more money to be made in health insurance than in healthcare delivery. So they decided to spin the hospitals off and to focus exclusively on health insurance, on both commercial and especially Medicare insurance. And the company did very well for many, many years. Um, but what we have seen is the consequence of what happens in healthcare when you do have these very big corporations who are really beholden to shareholders, and that is a problem that is unique to this country. We don't have systems like this anywhere else where you have major companies that have grown to massive size. United Health Group is now the fourth largest company in America, and there has been well-intentioned legislation that has been passed in over the years by both Republican and Democratic administrations that have been used by these big companies to fuel their growth and to determine exactly where that growth will take them. The Medicare Modernization Act of 2003 was one of those big bills that created the current version of the Medicare Advantage program. It tweaked the program that had been in existence for some time by encouraging more companies to come into the program, but also to encourage them to take on people with poor health conditions. Previously, it was a phenomenon in the industry in which these companies would cherry pick who they wanted to be in their plans, lemon drop the ones that they could get rid of if they were too costly for them. The Medicare Modernization Act sought to put it into that practice by saying, well, you can charge us more if people are sicker. And so the companies pretty quickly realized that they could gain that by upcoding, and they've done that tremendously well. The Affordable Care Act, some years later, was passed in 2010, had some well-intended provisions. It did bring more people into coverage, but we're paying massive amounts of money in subsidies to get more people insured. And by approaching limits on profitability, it incentivized these companies to venture into other parts of healthcare, in particular healthcare delivery. United Healthcare now, about half of its revenue and profits come from the healthcare delivery side of the house, from Optum. At Cigna, Cigna is no longer predominantly a health insurance company. It's really a big PBM that also has a health insurance company. CVS now owns Aetna, but it also owns CVS Caremark. It's big PBM. Aetna is its big health plan, but it also has more than 9,000 stores. So this vertical integration was created largely, or it really took off after the Affordable Care Act was passed, because there were limits on how much they could make as insurance companies. So there again, well-intentioned legislation along the way that has, in one way or another, created these beasts. We don't have a system, like as you noted, that was designed as we've seen in other countries historically. It just kind of created. It was kind of developed the way it developed. It's employer-based, and that's where we're unique in the world in that regard. And all of this has created incentives for these companies to get bigger and bigger, but there have not been incentives in place to control healthcare costs, or at the same time to make sure that more people not only are covered, but that they have plans that actually cover what they need so that they don't go broke paying their out-of-pocket cost. I've said a lot of words there, Lester, but that's, as I see it, some of the paths that we took in different ways, largely because lawmakers thought they were doing a good job, but it turned out that there were some unintended consequences of legislation. The intent was to try to keep these companies in the game, but they have enabled and really abetted massive consolidation in the industry to the point that you have just a handful of big, gigantic corporations now that increasingly call the shots when it comes to healthcare in this country.
Yeah, Wendell, I'm shocked how otherwise very intelligent people, whether we're talking a business owner, advisors in the space, or even when we start thinking about just the general consumer, the whole MLR, the minimum loss ratio rule, like when I tell people kind of what that means in plain English, they get it, but like didn't really understand it, number one. And number two, especially when you start talking about that, SMB, right? That small, medium-sized business, there's still so much of it that is still fully insured in that race that they're never winning. Expand on that because I think it's so important from if you were standing in front of a bunch of CEOs, explain the minimum loss ratio rule to a layman.
Yeah. And in fact, I have to take some responsibility, good or bad, for there being a provision in the Affordable Care Act that addressed the medical loss ratio. Um, Prior to the ACA being passed, insurers were largely the companies I work for, because of pressure from investors, were under pressure to spend less and less every quarter on patient care. And one of the measures that investors looked at very closely, they still do, is the medical loss ratio to see which way it's going. The more you spend paying someone's claims, the higher the medical loss ratio goes. And investors don't like that. They want to go the other direction. So before the ACA, it was definitely going the other direction. There were a lot of companies that had medical loss ratios for some books of business or 50%, and that's you know pocketing a lot of employers' money, and most
And
employers.
I want to make sure that maybe the audience that might not be as insurance nerdy as us, we're talking like when we talk about this, the loss ratio, it's of every dollar of premium, how much is actually going out in claims? And the example that you just gave, hey, the pressures to control that loss ratio, my Pollyanna, my desire would be, "Oh my gosh, it's because we're making everybody healthier."
Yeah.
I have a strange suspicion you're gonna tell me that the controlling of the loss ratio wasn't geared towards that side. It's what maybe is now being a shining light right now in the news of denials of claims and kind of the hoopla and language and things of that nature?
That's exactly right. And maybe just to go a bit further in explaining it, medical loss ratio, it's that term because insurers consider it a loss when they pay a claim,
Like,
hence the medical loss ratio. And it's understandable when you think about it that way. And they take in premiums and they want to hold on to as much premiums as they can. And certainly investors absolutely want them to spend less and less on people's care, people who are enrolled in their health plans. And we have seen, though, what happens. And I mentioned earlier the sin of turning our system over to investors, to Wall Street, because healthcare operates differently than any other sector of the economy. And when you have investors who are really breathing down the neck of the CEOs and the CFOs of these companies, they got to do some things to try to make sure if they didn't have a medical loss ratio that met Wall Street's satisfaction, they got to take some action to try to get the ship righted again. And that means they're going to be probably cranking up the use of prior authorization. And again, the medical loss ratio it restricts on their profits, but they will make you pay increasingly more out of your own pocket before your coverage kicks in. They will require you to do step therapy, all kinds of things. They will restrict your access to healthcare providers, to ones that they think that they can control the most, or that are not going to cost them as much as some other providers might. So they do a whole lot of things that fall into the whole category of what I've called these barriers that they've erected to make sure that they're doing all they can. These are levers that they have at their disposal. Sometimes they're not enough, as we have seen over the past year or so. The big buca companies have had just a disaster of a time on Wall Street over the past year. United, in particular, this year. Last year, it was Humana and CVS that were in the Wall Street doghouse. They're doing a little bit better this year, but now it's United's time. And United gained a lot of Medicare Advantage members from those that Aetna and Humana dumped. So they've grown their Medicare Advantage enrollment, but the executives had to acknowledge that some of those people that they signed up were people who were high cost. So Wall Street doesn't like that, and so that company is now less than half of its value from a stock perspective than it was just 6 months ago. It's astonishing what Wall Street when Wall Street speaks, these companies change, and these, CEOs have to, have to do what they must do, or they'll get sacked. Karen Lynch was, CEO of CVS. She lost her job last year. And just more recently, Andrew Whitty, lost his job at United. These are high stakes games with lots of money at play here, and investors do not like it when insurance companies have to acknowledge that they spent more paying claims than the executives assured them just a few months ago that they would be paying out.
And the executives that are making, athlete type money, right? When you start thinking about like how much is being brought home. This is a question that literally just popped in my head because people often ask me, how would you fix it, right? And it's interesting. I run a business. You run a business. We have KPIs, right? It's interesting that the KPIs that Wall Street uses, that these health insurance companies use, aren't actually in the direction and have the goal and objective that the end consumer of the product that they consume, it's so odd when you think about that. I guess I got two questions. Number one, um, was was that talked about in that corner office, in that boardroom with the investors in regards to what are the real KPIs, that are being, used here? And then maybe we'll switch to, Wendell's thoughts in regards to if you were in charge of it all, how would you change those KPIs?
The KPIs, you didn't hear too much conversation about that in the boardrooms or the C-suite, um,
Yeah.
because it's so dominated by what you have to do quarter to quarter to meet Wall Street's profit expectations. That is real, I can assure you, because I would prep with the investor relations people as we would get close to announcing quarterly earnings. And I mean, that's an intense time. And you can see as the numbers come in how pretty much how the street's going to react. So that's what's constantly on your mind. And you know that you have to try to maintain some positive relationship with doctors and hospitals because they deliver the product, if you will, uh, or deliver access to people, but they're not as important a stakeholder as a shareholder is or the big employer is. Those are the main stakeholders, and then you go down the line when you get to a patient, they're really at the bottom of the totem pole. They're not given very much consideration. I don't recall, to be honest with you, a single time in which, in those kinds of settings, there was a conversation about, okay, we really need to do what's best for individuals and their families. It just those conversations don't happen.
I mean, it's interesting. I knew where you were going with that statement, and it's it's sad. I mean, that's the only word that I could think of, like, because so much of the stereotype is that health care equals health insurance, and we both know that that is not the case, and health insurance, quite honestly, to your point, in however many years you were in your role, never heard health insurance talk about wanting and desiring to actually deliver the patient care, which is the purpose of the financing mechanism that they create to cover the health care that is being delivered. It's crazy.
It is crazy, and I'll make a distinction between those who are, in the trenches, who are working. They don't have that same visibility as
Visibly. Yeah, 100%.
so they see the world a bit differently, and I think justifiably, they can see that they make a positive difference in many cases in people's lives. But when the higher up the ladder you climb, the less and less patients become important to you. And one of the things you mentioned earlier is about compensation. One of the things I used to have to do was explain and defend corporate compensation, the CEO's compensation. And one of the things I said as a point to justify it was that 90% of the CEO's compensation is at risk. And most reporters bought that without questioning it much. He's paid mostly in stock in one form or another, stock in the company. And so his net worth every year is dependent on how well the company's stock price does. So when your own your own net worth, your livelihood is that closely
What
tied.
decisions are you gonna make?
Yeah, what exactly? Right. Yeah, and you know also that if you don't do it, not only you're not gonna, you're gonna get axed. You're gonna be shown the door.
That is, what's interesting, again, back to otherwise very intelligent people. One of the things I say off of stage every time I do a talk is, what does your health insurance company call your premium? And then it'll be silent, and there's a lot of people that might not know. I said they call that revenue. Please raise your hand in the room if you wake up in the morning wanting to lower your revenues. Nobody does. So why are we just appalled or surprised that health insurance is going to continue to go up when we hand somebody a dollar who calls that revenue and is beholden to the shareholder? I mean, it completely makes sense, but you rarely sit down to have a conversation of like, hey, by the way, you got to change the structure of this thing so you can get out of that misalignment of incentives that will never change if you still play in that premium equals revenue game.
Exactly. And the other thing so glad you mentioned that, and the way you explain that, it really should begin to wake people up to see it from a different perspective. But because of that, because they need to grow their revenues, it's a requirement they must do that. Uh, that means that they don't care that much about rising healthcare cost because because employers largely see these guys as the only game in town. You got to work with them one way or another. You've got a few to choose from, uh, but they're all playing the same game. They're all doing the same thing. As healthcare costs go up, whether we're talking about stay in the hospital or prescription drug or physician prices, they just increased premiums. And it's been going on, as you know, for decades, and it's still going on. You hear some of these business organizations say, well, it's not sustainable, uh, but they sustain it. They keep it going.
I'd be curious to get your opinion on the relationship between carrier and healthcare provider, and then on the other end of that, carrier and insurance advisor, because I think that that is talked about but not necessarily understood on the realities of those two types of relationships. So let's take carrier with hospital, because some people would say they need each other, some people say they hate each other, but we all know that every 4 years when the contract negotiations coming, they're in the media saying, no, you suck, no, you suck, and you're overpaid, and no, you're overpaid. What's the reality between that relationship?
That is very symbiotic. It is all of that that you said, and there is this finger pointing, and you've seen so many headlines in so many communities, right down to the wire. Such and such a hospital system's not going to be in Cigna's network next year because they can't come to terms. It's always, not always, but it's frequently that way. And I've often said that we now have larger hospital systems than we did back in the 90s because we saw such consolidation on the health insurance side. And we've had somewhat of an arms race on both sides. You had the companies, the big companies buying smaller competitors. There are far fewer insurance companies now than there were then because they've been gobbled up by the Cignas, Humanas, Uniteds, and Aetnas of the world. But as that was going on, the hospitals said, "Woo, we're at a competitive or at least a disadvantage at the negotiating table here because we're small potatoes compared to these guys." So they began to combine and bulk up to have, in my view, it was mainly to have more leverage, to be on a more of an equal thing with the people on the other side of the table. Uh, but it is still a symbiotic relationship. The insurers, the carriers know that they need to have most of the hospitals in network. They can do without some of them, but the ones that are big and prestigious, um, you're going to find them in the network, and you don't. The carriers don't have as much leeway or ability to negotiate lower rates with those companies. And like I said earlier, it's a game that goes on, and I think it's a good faith effort to try to get to something that's reasonable, but it has to be something that is profitable for both sides. It's the way negotiations are. Uh, but it just is a cycle that continues every year, and costs continue to go up. Uh, and uh, but it is symbiotic because the hospitals need the carriers have to have the hospitals. They point the finger of blame at each other all the time, and that serves them both because people get confused. Who is the bad guy here? Who is the villain in this particular negotiation? You don't necessarily know because you're not privy to what's being negotiated or who's trying to get the better of the deal. But the people who are most disadvantaged by this are the patients in some cases because they sometimes these deals do fall apart. And sometimes hospitals and certainly physician practices leave a network. And so you got to figure out what to do next if you're a patient of a doctor who's no longer in your network or the hospital you've been going.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be honest, right? They both the patient always loses because at the end of the day, none of those negotiations end up in lower costs of health care or health insurance. So let's go that to lose-lose. And back to the alignment of incentives. Imagine if they were both incentivized to make people super healthy. Like, what a novel concept. Like, don't try to fill beds, don't try to dispense pills, don't try to keep racking up premium. Let's put the KPIs so all of that has the desired results of what should be our country, which is a bunch of healthy, productive, happy people. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. Wendell, talk about the broker relationship. Um, it's funny, I've been one my entire career. I didn't understand it until I got to have a C in my title, in which my compensation was now tied to the stock price. And what I tell people all the time is I don't think anybody woke up in the morning purposefully trying to screw people. I just think, again, it goes back to if we all get paid on what the stock price does. And I remember now running my own business versus the decisions we would make, in the corporate world. I was like, this is the dumbest decision ever. Why are we making? Oh, we got to hit quarterly numbers.
Yeah.
Right? It was not like a decision that a sane business owner would make because you're always chasing that 90 days, that 90 days. But talk about that relationship between broker advisors, whatever anybody wants to call it, and the big health insurance companies.
Well, there too, it's a symbiotic relationship. They need each other. They have to have each other. Uh, and often, as I think you would attest, the brokers sometimes get too much in bed with the carriers, and they have incentives to prefer or to put a hard sell on their clients on a particular carrier. That's been going on for a long time, and there's not been, as you know, all that much transparency or awareness on the part of employers as to what really goes on, how brokers are being compensated, and that may be beginning to change, and I think it is beginning to change because there are a few more folks like you who are more ethical and transparent, but that's a problem as well too. And employers, I think, are at a disadvantage from not knowing how the relationships work and how what's at stake for the broker. Also, lately we're coming with the I think the Department of Justice has even brought a lawsuit against United that pertains somewhat to its relationship to some brokers. But we're also seeing some reporting about how the big carriers are using brokers and the way they compensate them to increase or suppress enrollment in their Medicare Advantage plans. So that's part of the game as well too. It's these carriers have different ways of trying to manipulate the membership or enrollment in their various health plans, and sometimes they do that by using brokers to a certain extent.
Yeah, I appreciate your honesty when you say, hey, I was part of the issue and the propaganda. I I mean, every cool thing I've ever done in my life has been because an insurance company took me to it. I mean, Humana flew me on a private jet to the Kentucky Derby in Louisville. I stayed in a room that I could never afford by myself. I've been to the Masters, I've been to the I mean, I've been everywhere because I was a good producer and or an executive for a major, health insurance advisor. And again, I go back to at the time, I didn't correlate the two things because I know myself and my own personal ethics would have never been, I am going to give Blue Cross this piece of business or Humana this piece of business because they took me to the Masters and I owe them one. But that does happen a lot of times. The percentage of contingencies and overrides as a percentage of their book of business on some of these firms, get up to 20, 30, 40%. So if you're like, wait a second, half of my kid, back to your thing here, my personal wealth is tied to making sure I have new business and retention bonuses with these carriers. What decision am I going to make? My kid goes to private school with this money and I drive a BMW, right? Like, I mean, that's just the reality of it. It's crazy when you take a step back, and I bet you're seeing this too. It's like, I knew it was bad. It didn't feel right. It's why I'm not there. But wow, I didn't correlate a lot of these things that were happening that until you get on the other side and you're looking at it from a landscape perspective, that you're like, this is really screwed up. It's worse than I thought.
You're so right, and for so many years, I was exactly as you were describing. I was flying on corporate jets all the time, staying at the finest hotels. When I was at Humana, every Kentucky Derby, it was, a week of partying. Uh, um, but yeah, it's you get accustomed to that. You're well paid, and you hang out with well-dressed, good-looking, educated people, and so
Right, right. I mean,
what's
it's the
wrong?
best job ever. I agree.
What's wrong with this? What's wrong with this? But few people do step back, and one reason is because they are so tied to that paycheck that's generous, but you don't want your lifestyle to take a hit, so you get on the a hamster wheel as well.
Yeah.
It's a gold-plated hamster wheel possibly, but still, it's not where if you could step back and really do a self-assessment, this is not the kind of person I really want to be in this world.
Kendall, Wendell, my niece is Kendall. Wendell, the only reason, not the only, but the main reason I am still not doing what I was doing before is my mom, who was at that time recently diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, said,
Mm.
you're always talking about how you would fix it. Stop being a wuss and go do it. And that was literally the motivation I had to leave what was the second highest ranking official in a $350 million practice, making a lot of money at age 31, 32, right? And it was one of those things that reality of my parents already filed bankruptcy because of my dad's expenses. My mom has got pancreatic cancer, and I'm like, what am I doing that I'm building the same plans and doing the same crap that put my parents in harm's way? My mom's wake-up call for me was, if I'm on my deathbed, what will I regret more? Right? And that was 100% of the decision that has put me in the place that I am today, which is a hell of a lot harder. It was easy to sell Blue Cross, but the fulfillment and the knowledge that working and getting to be with people like you that do get up in the morning with a different desire is way more gratifying than the stock price or the paycheck will ever be.
It is so it's so and what you said just now, actually, sent some chills up my spine because I ultimately said when I decided to leave the industry and do what I'm doing now, uh, I had this vision of being on my deathbed and, regretting not having done what I felt was the right thing to do at a certain point in my life, and I didn't wanna be there. I wanted to, when that day comes, be pretty satisfied that I did what I could do, which I felt was the right thing to do. But I understand exactly what you're saying. That
Yeah.
if people would think about that, envision their own mortality or understand their own mortality and do what's right, not only for themselves, but for their families. I'd stay in this game because I think it's a noble fight, but also for my kids and grandkids.
Yeah, yeah. So we've been a little gloomy. I want to now switch it to, oh crap, there's some really cool things that are going on. What are a couple things, Wendell, that you see in the industry that make you excited? Uh, a lot of things that I know you put in your newsletters and things that you're shining the light on, good things that are happening. What are a couple things that make you excited?
Yeah, on the in the private sector, I'm seeing more and more, interest and alternatives to the big giant corporations and some really good companies, some good businesses that, are much more transparent, and I think, are really, looking out after the best interest of employers and the people who work for those companies. I'm seeing, this whether we're talking about, benefit plans or, pharmacy benefit managers and things like that. Uh, there's a significant change in the industry, and you see it too because we've been at some of the same conferences, spoken at many of the same conferences with the folks who are engaged in this work, and that gives me a great deal of hope, that there is, the ability to change this system in the private sector. It's awfully darn hard to expect our politicians to fix something. I do spend a lot of time still in Washington because I think that's important to educate them so that they don't make matters worse. But I am seeing even in Washington more of an understanding whether and I lately have been visiting a lot of Republican offices more than Democrats because they hold the power right now. But there's a growing awareness and understanding of how these big carriers, through their PBMs and the way they market and manage their Medicare Advantage plans, and the barriers that they have erected, how that is not in the best interest of their constituents, and how these companies have really gamed the system that they had tried at different points in time to make better, to keep bad things from happening. So there's growing awareness and more of an interest in approaching these problems from a bipartisan point of view than I've seen in ages and ages. And I'm seeing the insurance industry and getting much more scrutiny by policymakers, by the media, by the courts, and by employers than I have ever seen. So those are, I think, are positive developments. But I would say that probably the most positive is again what I'm seeing in the private sector. And that gives me hope.
So, on the spot, we didn't rehearse this. We're recording this in the middle of May. Yesterday and the day before, or yesterday mostly, President Trump, said, "Hey, we're going to do something about this pharmaceutical pricing." Are you familiar? Can speak to it. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, what the president is proposing and uh, trying to do, at least through executive order, and there's questions as to whether that's a possibility, is shifting to a means of how we price or how pharmaceuticals are priced in this country based on the average price of other developed countries. It's called reference-based pricing, and if and it would be something that would create a system in which we would have far less expense for pharmaceuticals in this country, because we do spend a lot more for prescription medications in this country than any other country, period. Uh, uh, we spend more than any other country, period, on healthcare broadly. We spend about twice as much per capita on healthcare as we do as any other country on the planet. I think that was a bold move, but again, you can expect lawsuits to be filed. Whether it can be done through executive order is one thing, but it has provoked legislation. Democrats are saying, "Okay, I'll do one better. Let's pass legislation to create that." So we'll have to see how that flies. Know that the one thing that I know and learned very well during my years working in the industry is how powerful these big industry groups are. The pharmaceutical industry is inordinately powerful. The insurance industry is as well too. Hospitals they all have huge amounts of power. They make uh, huge campaign contributions. They have armies of lobbyists. So I think that's well intentioned. We'll have to see what develops, but I think that it would bring a lot of relief to a lot of people who just simply cannot afford their medications. I don't want to let the insurance companies off the hook because they play a big role too in their role in the pharmacy supply chain through their PBMs, and that's why so many of us often have to pay a ton of money out of our own pockets at the pharmacy counter, even with our insurance card. But I applaud him.
Yeah, yeah. So as we wrap up here, I'd love for you. You talked about some of the things that make you excited. Do you have a story that comes to mind of like something you've either interviewed or saw or whatever of like an employer doing something? What did they do? Anything that's like a tangible story we could leave the audience with?
I not a particular story, but I've been on panels. Uh, Folks in Wisconsin seem to be doing quite a bit. I've been on a number of panels there, and I've talked to some pretty sizable employers in the Milwaukee area. Just came to mind as you asked that, who shifted away from working with a big carrier to a lesser known but a more transparent carrier, and I've seen the results. They're spending far less. Their employers are happier. It takes some guts to do that because you're making a change, and often your employees don't want change. They think they've got a stable health benefit plan. So if you're making a switch on them, you have to overcome that. But that's an important thing to do. So I'm encouraged that even some of the sizable employers are beginning to recognize that they can save money and do better by their workers by making a shift, by looking at this from a different perspective, and not necessarily just believing that working with Cigna or United or my broker who says they're the greatest things to slice bread, overcome that.
Yeah, yeah. So, Wendell, if you have the floor, in the audience are employers and advisors, what's the thing that Wendell Potter says to them that they need to go do? What's that thing?
That they need to understand the power that they have. Uh, we have an employer-based system. They have an inordinate power. They've just been reluctant to use it. They've been afraid of getting involved in the political process for fear of backlash. But if they really want this system to change, and if they do believe, as they say, that the current system is not sustainable, they've got to do more to become better educated, but also to be more vocal about what we need to do and the role that they need to play. And they have an inordinate voice, and it's important that they begin to figure out how to work together, to work collectively and individually to change the system.
Love that. Love that. Wendell, I think you and I could have a 9-hour podcast because I could talk to you forever. If somebody listens to this and like, man, this guy knows a lot, and or wants to sign up for your newsletter, how does somebody find you, get a hold of you, sign up for your newsletter, follow you so they can learn more from you? Where can they find you?
My newsletter is Healthcare Uncovered. That's healthcareuncovered.substack.com. It's fast growing, well read, and we adhere to journalistic integrity. So check us out. We hold the industry to account. I'm at my advocacy organization is the Center for Health and Democracy. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on social media at Wendell Potter.
Awesome. Wendell, thank you for well, it's my podcast. I was just about to ask if I was allowed to say something. I'm like, wait a second, it's my podcast. Thank you for having the balls to stand up and, after learning, right? I end most public speaking things that I do with a picture of Spider-Man. And, with the Peter Parker quote, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And knowledge to me is one of the most powerful powers that somebody could have. And so a lot of times I think the excuse that people will give is, I just didn't know there was another option, right? It's why I started this podcast, to make sure that people constantly are hearing and can dig through things. But, people like you are on stage writing these newsletters, using their power, their reach, their brand after the knowledge that they gained from the inside. And I think, again, people don't know. I mean, I was called a fool. I was called an idiot. I was called all of these things for leaving such a, cush job. Let's call it what it is. And I just appreciate looking on the other side of the screen, seeing somebody that was at a level way higher than I was, that did the same thing because of the right reason. So I just wanted to thank you on behalf of everybody that might hear this, that you had the courage to do it, and not only had the courage to do it, continue to shine that light on the industry that, quite honestly, moves so much of our world. I mean, there's not a person that doesn't know somebody who struggles with healthcare, has had a healthcare issue themselves. It's, 18, 19, depending on the percentages you see of our GDP. We spend more than any developed country by far, but we're not even healthier and don't live any longer. It's like, by all degrees, we have failed completely, like miserably, and it's going to take a bunch of yous out there to turn that Titanic. So I just wanted to thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for having me on the show. You're doing great.
Awesome. To our audience, go subscribe to his newsletter. It's an easy read. Even my, reading comprehension level of a 3-year-old follows the newsletter. It's written in such a way that you can understand it. So go subscribe to it. And if you liked this, please give it a share. Wendell is somebody that the rest of us that are trying to do this, and Wendell was also one of the co-producers in our documentary. So if you haven't watched the documentary, it's not personal. It's just healthcare. Wendell was shining more of a light on there, so you'll get to consume more of him. Wendell, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much. And tune in next time to another episode of Impact Healthcare.
You've been listening to Impact Healthcare, people and strategies that are disrupting the health benefits industry with Lester Morales. Remember, the journey to getting 20% savings on your healthcare benefits starts with total transparency. Remember to subscribe to the Impact Healthcare podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.